Here we are. We're getting into the big stories for today. Joining us as we look at Parliament and its resumption, as we look at the Sir John issue, as we also contend with the monetary policy going north. Yeah. We'll be joined by Sam Obeng, Executive Director, Africa Parliamentary Network. We also have others joining the conversation. Dr. Theo Champong, an economist, and we'll have others also joining the conversation. We also have Gilfred Boateng Esiama, a research analyst with the CDD. Okay, so I'll start with Mr. Obeng. I know definitely you would like to get into the bit to do with Parliament, but first of all, let me say a very good morning to all of you, gentlemen.
Good morning.
All right, you're looking spick and span, raring to go. Okay. Parliament is back. How do you find that? I mean, yes, we expected them back, but looking at all the dynamics the Parliament has to deal with. 3 members of Parliament supposedly to go before the Privileges Committee. The Speaker of Parliament saying that Parliament is actually broke because the Finance Ministry has not, given it the right funds to conduct its work and all of that. What is your take on Parliament's resumption?
Well, indeed, we know that every year the House has 3 meetings. The first meeting spanning usually between January and April. The second from May sometimes to about August, and the third spanning October to December. And so this being the second meeting, it is only statutory, it is required, Parliament must meet. And there is indeed a lot to be done during second meetings. Second meetings are traditionally the meetings that are used for lawmaking, because usually the first meeting will have the president present the State of Nation address, it will be debated. Third meeting will have the budget. And so second meeting are heavy on, passing bills. They are heavy sometimes also on the media review, and they are heavy also on other representative functions that members of Parliament have to take, such as questions and statements. So these second meetings are very, very important. And if Parliament has a challenge with resources to be able to do its work effectively, that is really, really a very big problem. Parliaments the world over require resources to be able to do their work effectively. And we have been talking about the independence of Parliament. If Parliament will be independent, if Parliament will be able to assert itself as a co-equal branch of government that, will have to do the work that it has to do through making laws, overseeing the executive branch, and also representing the people, then it must be adequately resourced. And to hear this from the Right Honorable Speaker, not the first time, not the second, quite a number of times, means that it is really, really a big problem which we need to tackle. But it comes to the bigger problem.
Where do you think the problem lies? Because he's pointing to the Finance Ministry and all of this. And it's interesting when you look at the dynamics. Baron de Montesquieu, just going back to my political science days, and separation of powers and checks and balances and all of that. We need these arms of government to be co-equal. And of course, though their funding is not exactly the same amount, we see the executive, because it is in power, usually, giving or having quite a bit of access to the largesse of the state. But when Parliament is handicapped in this way, time and again, I mean, what does that mean? And what does that mean for that role that Parliament must play as a co-equal of the 2 other branches?
Well, traditionally, Parliaments, again, the world over has, quite a number of ways in which they are resourced. Usually, we would say 3 ways stands out. The first, and of course, the largest chunk comes from the government, because Parliament is doing government business. It's a branch of government, and so it must be adequately resourced. Of course, we've seen instances where in some Parliament, they also generate some internal resources as part of the independence of Parliament's agenda through means that innovative means that parliaments can think about. And then, of course, there are third sources where we have development partners supporting certain items on parliament's budget line. So you have donors and all of those things. But the first stream of supporting parliament or resourcing parliament, which is through the government budget, is the most important. And for me, these issues speaks to the bigger national concern of we not having enough resources to administer the state. And it is a big concern if your parliament is inadequately resourced to the extent that the Speaker of the House, who usually will be having exchanges and engagement with the executive branch behind closed doors, will now have to come to the full glare of the public through his opening remarks to Parliament to speak about these issues. It means that it is a very, very big problem. And the handlers of our national purse must take these matters very, very seriously. We as civil society, you as members of the Fourth Estate, must take these matters seriously. And we must ask the right questions, about why our parliament is not being resourced the way it has to be resourced.
We ought to be asking those questions. Let me also engage Godfred Boateng Isiama, research analyst with the CDD. On that same tangent, Parliament is back, but Parliament is also broke. Your quick reactions.
Hello?
Yes, Godfred, I can hear you.
Yes, can I get the question again?
Okay, so I don't know whether you followed the discussion up to this point, but I was just interacting with Samuel Bing of the Africa Parliamentary Network, and we're talking about the problems around Parliament, especially as the Speaker says Parliament is broke, and that's because the Finance Ministry has not, followed through on certain allocations to them. I'm asking for your quick reaction on that and the resumption of the work of Parliament.
Well, I think we have said it time and again, the fact that some state institutions need to be financially independent. And once we take that financial autonomy from them, then their work can even be undermined by the executive. And that is something that I think going forward we should be thinking about. Some agencies are horizontal agencies of accountability who have some powers granted by them by the Constitution to hold the executive accountable. And so when the executive has a lot of leverage in terms of deciding when and how they should receive their funds to do the work that they are mandated by the Constitution of Ghana to do, then I think it's something that is challenging. We need to go back to that conversation about how to make Parliament a little bit financially independent in order for them to execute their mandate.
What real problems does this pose for the work of Parliament, especially as they don't have what they need? Sam was just talking earlier about the fact that, Parliament needs these resources to be able to play certain roles that we all expect it to. Without that, how is this going to impact, the proper running of Parliament?
Well, Parliament has some key mandates and some key responsibilities. They have oversight mandates, and we see Parliament sometimes moving to the field to check, inspect projects, ask questions, and come back and hold the executive accountable. So if Parliament does not have the resources at their disposal to do the basic and fundamental things that they are supposed to do, then accountability suffers at the end. So I think this is something that all of us must come on board to discuss the issue, and we should find a resolution. Because if your the Parliament we have now is weak. I mean, in terms of the leverage that the executive have on Parliament, the Parliament is weak.
Our Parliament is weak.
Our Parliament is weak. There is no doubt about that. The kind of structural arrangement we have makes them weak. So to suffer further in relation to their financial autonomy, I think it further weakens Parliament's ability to do the things that they are supposed to do.
Do you think this can be sometimes done to keep the executive above, the legislative body in a way? Do you feel sometimes these mechanisms are intentional?
It will be very difficult for me at this point in time to impute, that kind of motive from the actions and inactions of the executive. Who knows? Maybe we don't have the resources as it is to give them for them to do their work, and it may be the case that other government agencies do not also have the resources for them to be able to execute their mandate. But well, you can't also, write it off entirely. It is one of the possibilities, except that I can't see at this time that is the reason why they are not being given the resources that they need to do their work.
But let me ask you this quickly. So we know about the basic ways Parliament gets resourced. And so the three arms of government, the legislature will approve the budgets of other bodies. In like manner, Parliament's budget will be approved and all of that. In recent times, we have seen the Speaker call for more. And he has even had to take on the executive and say, how can you be, increasing your budget and expecting ours to shrink by such numbers? But beyond what funding the state gives to Parliament, like Sam Obeng mentioned, there are other avenues. Should Parliament, on the back of these happenings, should Parliament be looking more at these other avenues in order to lessen its dependence on the state?
Well, I didn't follow Same's discussion, but I think the simple point I want to make is that if those avenues are legitimate for Parliament to generate these resources for them to do their work, why not? There shouldn't be anything wrong with it but it also doesn't discard the issue off the table. The issue that Parliament needs to be financially independent also needs to be there. There must be some guarantee that they will get at least the resources that they need for them to function. That guarantees must be there.
Okay. Before I move on to Dr. Theo Champo, I just want to come back to you, Sam. So you started talking about this bit about other avenues of, funding itself, the legislative body. What are some of these other avenues? And do you feel, like I'm asking, that Parliament should start focusing more on some of these? Though I know that the chunk of what they get is from the state. Do you feel they should be increasing these other sources of revenue, so to speak, so that it can also decrease its dependence on the state? But the other angle to consider would be that if they did that, what would it mean in terms of maybe other people having influence on Parliament? That's the question to you.
Yeah, and Benjamin, it is important to note that even in the midst of these other avenues, it does not negate the responsibility of government to resource Parliament. In fact, that is a primary source of funding for Parliament. And under no circumstances must it be shrunk. Under no circumstances must it be withheld. Under no circumstances must it be delayed. If the executive branch does that, then it is an affront to the constitutional responsibilities that Parliament will have to undertake. And so my argument about, globally, other sources through which parliaments, resource their work is not to say that this should, take away the responsibility of government to resource Parliament. I've said that in other parliaments, you've actually found parliaments being supported in some of their programs, work programs. Usually some of the oversight work that they do, implementing their own strategic plan, institutional strengthening and all of that through grants and development partners supporting. But these are usually very limited. And in Ghana, where development partners have actually supported parliamentary work a lot in the early 2000s, right through to sometime in 2010, getting closer to 2020, that pool of resources have shrunk. Resourcing for parliamentary work has actually gone very down globally. But even in Ghana, it is more serious because development partners are shifting towards other parliaments who need better resources for institutional strengthening. So that is not coming much so far as the Ghana Parliament is concerned. Some other parliaments have also looked at other internally generated ways of raising revenue. So some of them also have, like we have in our Ghana Parliament, a training institute, which usually would conduct trainings at a fee and all of those things. But these are very, very minimal so far as the total budget, figures are concerned. And I must say that if you rely on any of these other two, then you are really positioning your parliament for real problem if it's an absolute reliance on that, because donors have their own demands and expectations and interest, but the primary source must always be the government source. And we cannot live in a country where, like Guilfred noted, and the speaker has said this, and parliamentarians have said this many times, having the executive budget go up every now and then, having some very, very interesting, expenditure lines that, in our opinion, are useless, not inuring to the benefit of the Ghanaian people, continuing, along the executive line, and yet the legislative branch, which is supposed to be the house of the people, is, denied of the resources that they need to do the work that they need to do. This cannot be countenanced, and we shouldn't be entertaining this at all.
Well, thank you for those salient thoughts. Let me bring in Dr. Theo Echampong, an economist who joins the conversation as well. Doc, a very good morning to you.
Morning, my brother.
It's a pleasure having you. So we start with Parliament, and of course that's where we've kick-started the conversation. Let's stay there. Parliament is broke, the Speaker says. I want your take on that and how you feel as an economist this would impact the work of the House, because it is tied to our finance streams, it is tied to the finance ministry making the right allocations and all of that. How troublesome is this?
I mean, I am worried, and it should never even have come to the point that an important institution such as Parliament would literally, to quote, be broke. Because at the end of the day, Parliament, like most of the other constitutional bodies, is funded directly by the central government. But the work that they do for me is so critical that it should never even get to the point where the Speaker or any of the leadership would have to beg central government for what is due them to be given. And this is worrying, because then it even affects the work of Parliament. Because remember, it's not just the parliamentarians. There are other workers who are on government payroll. There are other institutions that are aligned to Parliament. And to the extent that they are not getting their stipends and receipts on time, then that obviously affects, the work of Parliament. The question I ask myself is it really the case that the central government doesn't have the money? I doubt, because we tend to spend money on other resources, such as, for example, Samim makes a very good point. Look, we waste a lot of money in the system. And if we really want Parliament to work, we would find the resources to get it to work. I feel perhaps also there's a little bit of the politics, right, at play here, where in the last few kind of months, the government has struggled to get certain key bills passed through the House. And politically, you could feel that perhaps, what the central government is trying to do is literally punish the House for not, kowtowing to its interest. That could also be a significant factor here, not just the fact that...
You feel that is a factor in this mix?
I think we cannot discount that factor. We've seen evidence, we've seen the rhetoric, we followed the events, and it is quite clear to me, at least in my head, that there could also be some sort of political brinkmanship happening behind the scenes, which is pushing government not to allocate what is due Parliament, on time.
It's curious. It's curious you say that. Pardon the interjection, because the Speaker says, after saying, and I'll get to the main point I want to, after saying, and I'm quoting him here, Alban Bagman, Parliament is currently being run on arrears, and the House should not be treated like one of the ministries, departments, and agencies. If they want Parliament to run around, they should let us know. Then he says, tied to what you're saying, the Speaker is not ready and prepared to be blamed for the inability to get parliamentary business going on just because we are not getting the necessary funding. So the fact that he throws in getting parliamentary business going, and some of what we've seen in the past, it feeds into what you're saying, that this could have its own political elements.
Of course, look, everything that has an economic decision has a political dimension. That's why, for some of us, we study political economy, and we cannot discount the influence of, the decision makers, and sometimes, to call it bluntly, people's personal squabbles in affecting the work of certain institutions. In this case here, Parliament. And given the issues that the Speaker has had with, let's call it central government, given some of the, back and forth, for me, it stands to reason that perhaps there's also an element of, tit for tat happening in this regard. I don't believe that, the country is like necessarily that broke that we cannot fund a core and key institution such as Parliament. It beggars belief.
Well, the Majority Chief Whip gave some comfort when he made mention of the fact that the Finance Ministry they have this in the offing to make payment in terms of the NHI, the GET Fund, and the District Assembly's Common Fund. So hopefully Parliament would, get their share of the cake. But quickly, there's also the bit about, in the mix of this, and curiously, yesterday, as we have it, the minority didn't approve of a budgetary allocation, a critical one, and it had to do with their decision or their stance that COVID-19 expenditure must be thoroughly investigated. On the back of that, the minority yesterday refused to join forces with the majority to approve this budgetary allocation. Maybe some of those matters that are creating a frosty environment, as far as the executive and the legislature are concerned. But how relevant is this and the posturing of the minority?
No, I mean, the minority is doing its work, and rightfully so. The work of Parliament is to check what the executive does. The challenge has been that in our case, or in the major part of the Fourth Republic, Parliament has become an appendage to the executive. So they've always had their way. And what this new Parliament that we've had with, the almost evenly split seat is basically acting as an additional layer of checks and balance on the work of the executive. So what they're doing, I don't think we should take anything away from them in terms of ensuring that any monies that are spent are properly accounted for and properly audited. And we've had issues within the civil society community to even raise questions about, some of those COVID expenditures. So I think it's rightful that some sort of audit is done on those monies that were spent during the COVID period. But as far as I'm concerned, the minority is doing its work.
Don't you think this like with the e-levy is going to stall a lot of what? Look, mind you, we're in dire economic straits already. So many dynamics to deal with. Yes, we've got the e-levy kicking, but these refusals to approve, budgetary allocations because of the numbers, isn't that going to stymie the very work of Parliament and by extension, the work of the executive arm of government business?
Well, it has already done that to an extent. We saw with e-levy, we've seen a bit of that, even with some of the EJAPA conversations, things like that. I think what it calls for is more consensus building. And this, hawkish approach by both sides to tone down and work in the collective interest of the country. But that does not also mean that, the right checks and balances on spending by government, by central agencies, because that's the work of Parliament, should not be undertaken. But I do get your point, and I think, yes, more consensus, more dialogue should be taking place, and the opposition should not unnecessarily, hinder the effective running of the central government machinery. But at the same time, they also have an important constitutional mandate or role to play in checking some of the spending by central government.
Do hold for me, Dr. Champong. Let me bring in Sam Obing, who is also with us. He's been patiently waiting. He's with the Africa Parliamentary Network. Now, there's also the thorny issue of the infamous three: Sarah Adrasafo, Henry Quartey, Kennedy Ejapong. Yesterday, we heard from Sarah Adrasafo, a fantastic interview by my own colleague and brother, Blessed Soga. And very revealing, some of what she says. But of great interest, the fact that she says she's not even aware of this summons to appear before the Privileges Committee and so many other dynamics. In other words, suggesting that her own party people who are gunning for her removal don't have the facts right. She states categorically that Mr. President is my appointing authority when it comes to my work as a Minister for Gender, Children and Social Protection, and I'm not moving an inch. When I return, I take my position. Let's start from there. The posturing of Sarah Adrasafo versus her absence in Parliament and her absence from ministerial work. How does that rub off on you?
Well, so it is important to, and good job to Joy News, I must say. I think that for a member of Parliament, that the members of Parliament and parliamentary committees and the whole nation have been looking to hear from her, and we've been struggling with that. For you to have her for a full show, was quite impressive. But to say that, of course, the president is the appointing authority for ministers. If the president, as the CEO of the executive branch, decides that somebody that he has employed, who has been out of office for so long, should still remain out of office and still keep the job, that's the president's prerogative. I think that that's a conversation for another day, to look at whether the reasons why the excuse have been requested, are in tandem with the time and resources that probably may be spent.
So she mentions, she indicates, and she indicated yesterday that, of course, as we've come to know, familial matters, child going through a situation. We know how the system is in the United States. Your child could be taken from you by the state. But at the same time, she has many more children in her constituency and many more children in Ghana to deal with, especially in respect of her ministry. So, I don't know, weighing them, nuclear family versus everything else, because she's also a public, servant. So should she then not be told, yes, family, and it's important, but step aside so someone else can do the work?
Well, and so I was just going to come to the parliamentary side of things. I was laying this as a preamble for the executive branch of things. But like you rightly noted, for the parliamentary side of things, I am a father. Of course, I'm expected to do my job at Parliamentary Network Africa. My son or daughter may be having their own set of challenges, which I may be required to play my fatherly duties. Of course, there may be some conversations between myself and my employer on handling some of these matters. But especially when you are in public service, there must be that thin line. Some people have asked why we are discussing, for example, a dead man's will when it is his own will and, it is private property and all of that. But hey, he decided to go into public service. He decided to go into an arena where there's our resources that gets to pay him, where his acts and actions and inactions can affect every one of us. And this is the same arena that Madam Adrasafo has entered into. There are so many people in Dom Kwabenya who have not been represented in Parliament for several months. And this, in my opinion, cannot be encouraged. I completely empathize with her. As a father myself, I can appreciate when you've got to deal with matters relating to family. But there is also the bit about making choices, and making sure that you understand what must give for what you've got to do legitimately. Because, we cannot say that if one is having a son or a daughter who is struggling with one issue or the other, the person must neglect his or her job forever. That cannot be a tangible excuse. I think that, if in other jurisdictions, we should be having conversations about the fact that, look, your children are extremely important. You've got to definitely take care of them. You've got to avoid a situation where social services are taking them away from you. But please do not take for granted the many other people who've got to be represented in your constituency.
Is that what you feel she's doing? Is that what you feel she's doing? Is she taking them for granted? Because mind you,
well, in my opinion, we cannot have a member of parliament who fails to attend to parliament for several months, in fact, we're done 2 meetings of parliament. We are in the 3rd meeting, so close to 1 year, missing out on parliament and not doing the honorable thing and saying that, look, I've got to take care of family. Family is so important. So please, I would want to perhaps relinquish my role as a member of parliament. We should be having such conversations, in my opinion. And it doesn't only have to deal with Honorable Adwoa Safo. Any member of parliament who feels that the role that has been given you by your constituents, you cannot play it adequately and effectively. One, because you have other pressing responsibilities, even including those of them who are serving as ministers, and are not taking seriously the roles that they are supposed to play in parliament. They must learn to do the honorable thing. In other jurisdictions, this will not be a conversation that we are having in the way that we are having it. No.
So she says that nobody can sack her from her position. I mean, the ministerial position, apart from the president, which is, true. But she couches it in the sense that all of you are talking, you're doing a lot of talk, but you're not the appointing authority. Mr. President says I should be there, and I'm still going to be there. She also says she'll return and take up the position, including the parliamentary position, where in fact, we know of the developments in her constituency, and the fact that she wants to return to that post. Is that wrong? Is that I don't want to say immoral because it's not the right, but is that politically correct for her to be thinking along those lines?
On the bit about the president not being the only person, in fact, the president being the only person who can take care of her role, she's right on that. And of course, the ball is in the court of the president, to administer his executive branch effectively. But when it comes to parliament, it's a different ball game.
Okay, before you get into parliament, quickly, before you get into parliament, if you were the appointing authority, would you have sacked Adwoa Safo by now?
Well, I do not have the set of information that the appointing authority has, and so it would be very unfair to make a determination on this particular subject matter. Perhaps they have conversations that go deeper than you and I are privy to.
Okay, so on the parliamentary end?
But on the parliamentary bit, clearly, look, there are about 30 million of us. Let's assume that we are just about 27.5 million with 275 constituencies. What it means is that averagely, we're having each member have to represent about 100,000 people, right? Now, this is 100,000 people in Dom Kwabenya who for the past 8-9 months have not been represented in parliament, because without her, nobody, her PA cannot represent her, any other member of parliament cannot represent these people, have not been represented in parliament. Let's look at how serious this matter is. This matter is equivalent to the people of the South area who are not being represented in parliament. This matter is equivalent to any other constituency that do not have representation in parliament for a very long time because a member of parliament decides that I am not coming to the house. And it has its own ramifications. You are talking about how, she mentioned, and I listened to the show, she mentioned she not having received the Privileges Committee's sermons. I have done parliamentary development work for a while. I have actually, in my days when I used to do service in Parliament, I was assigned to the Privileges Committee, and so I know how the committee operates. I know, and I'll be very surprised that the committee will schedule a date and would not have summoned the individual who needs to be on that particular committee. But you heard members of the committee say, and we heard your own reporter who also said that he has spoken to people within the committee secretariat who had mentioned that they had sent official emails to the official email address that is on the records of Parliament. They have sent WhatsApp messages with a letter to the official telephone number that is on the records of Parliament. They have actually deposited a hard copy letter to her secretariat. And of course, if you are not physically present, then you will be missing out on some of these things. And that is why I congratulated you in the beginning as having been able to, as Joy News, get her onto that particular interview.
Interesting point you make. Let me bring in Guilford once more. Now, Guilford, following from the trade of questions, does Adwoa Safo, when she says, "I have not given up on my party," the New Patriotic Party, she was there at a point for the vote on the e-levy, and then she upped and left again. Since then, they have needed her additional vote, looking at the dynamics of our parliament. They have not had that. Maybe if they had Adwoa Safo in place, what happened recently, what happened yesterday in terms of that budgetary approval wouldn't have been poo-pooed by the minority. And so does she have the moral right, so to speak, to say that this is still my position and I'm coming back and I'm going to take over again? As and when she'll return, we do not even know. She talks about the fact that she has served the party, deputy majority leader, leader of the women's caucus and all of that, and that she has never done this before. And so that should be held. We should know that this is an exigency she cannot do without. Does she have the moral right to do this?
Well, at a personal level, I think you will sympathize with the woman if you listen to her story and the way she narrates her story. She's the only one who knows what she's going through. So at that personal level, you understand her on that.
Guilford, if you could speak up a bit, I'd be very grateful.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Better now.
Okay, I'm saying at a personal level, you probably will understand and sympathize with her, listening to how she narrates her incident and what she's going through. But the other level, we are building a nation. We are building institutions. Rules must be respected. And leaders of our country must lead some examples. If this and what she is doing is happening at all levels of governance, can you imagine what will happen? So I think she really doesn't have the kind of moral right to be saying the things that she's saying, that I am coming back to take my ministry, having been absent for how many months.
So Adwoa Safo does not have the moral right to be saying, "I'm coming back to take up these positions." On the back of
right thing, and the honorable thing, as my colleague has spoken about, was for her to just, step aside. Because there's something that you love to do, there's something that you want to do to help, but you are not in the capacity to do it. So why don't you get off completely and allow somebody to come and do it? If you are passionate about children and women, as you claim to be, if you are passionate about the people in your constituency, for how long are you going to be absent or be in the capacity not to execute the functions and the things that you love so much? And again, preventing other people from being in the same position to do that. So on that basis, as I said earlier, I sympathize with her. She may be going through a lot. But at the same time, there are times, tested principles and things that people do when they find themselves in similar situations. They can't do it. So they step aside for other people to do the work.
Right.
So I think, she probably needs to rethink some of the things she stated and what she wants to do in the future.
Right. Let me just make this point. Of course, we say what is good for the goose is good for the gander. In this instance, there are gentlemen involved. Henry Quartey, Greater Accra Regional Minister. We also have Kennedy Ejapong, Member of Parliament for Asin Central. And of course, Henry Quartey is Member of Parliament as well, Ayawaso Central. These two gentlemen haven't, quote, been hounded the way Adwoa Safo has. Are we being unfair to her on that level? Is it men ganging up against her? Because you look at even the rhetoric within the party. A lot of the men, those who have questioned Adwoa Safo and been very vitriolic in their attacks, have mostly been men, leadership in her party. Are we being fair to her?
Well, if the reason for attacking her is because she's a woman, then that definitely is not something, that can be accepted in any way.
But Guilford, no one would come out and say we're attacking her because she's a woman. But we see the trajectory of things. And these other men who have done the same thing are not being vilified like this.
Well, if the other men have done the same thing, I don't know whether the dynamics are the same. When the party needed these representatives and how they got them, whether they got them at the right time and the time that they wanted them to be there. So I think the dynamics can also, play part. I don't want to start off by blaming the men and also, just reprimanding them because some have spoken, against Adwoa Safwa. So that's what I don't want to do, not having the full set of facts before them that they did what they did. But I think under this circumstance, I would have even preferred that line of argument that once you fail to present yourself to Parliament within a stated period of time, automatically you should be taken out of Parliament. That discretion and a lot of emphasis from people within the party and people within Parliament talking about Adwoa Safwa, and some even think that probably is part of the reason why they want to bring this report to the Privileges Committee, interrogate them, and make their own, declarations or decisions based on what they hear. And another thing is that, well, there's been an argument about whether when they finish, that decision should be final or not. And I think if that mechanism is being put in place to single her out and punish her, then that is not something to be accepted, and that is not something to be tolerated. Everyone who has found themselves in this same scenario must suffer the consequences as stated by law and as ruled by the courts of this country.